All right, welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled, Is the Quad's Rise Destabilizing Asia? My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. With U.S. China tensions remaining high, the Biden administration is doubling down on the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, with its partners in India, Japan, and Australia. What started off as a security dialogue is increasingly morphing into something more of a military arrangement with joint military exercises and all. India plays a key role in the Quad, and Washington has placed a very high priority on India's integration in the security architecture of Asia that the United States is leading. But recent tensions between India and China has, of course, further pushed India closer to the United States. The question, though, is, does the Quad's trajectory, this military trajectory of the Quad, increase the risk of a Cold War with China? And can the Quad be repurposed in order to reduce that risk? To address these important questions, we have an excellent panel that will be moderated by Rachel Esplen-Odell of the Quincy Institute. And I want to mention that the idea behind the Quad is very much coming from an excellent brief that Sarang Shidore produced for the Quincy Institute. We are lucky to have him on this panel, and you will hear from him more soon. For those of you who are joining via Zoom, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and Rachel will get to those questions throughout the conversation. If you are watching this on YouTube or any other platform, you can use the comment section in order to ask your questions, and Rachel will get to those as well. So with no further ado, please welcome Rachel, who will kickstart the conversation and introduce the panelists. Rachel?
Yes, thank you very much, Trita. And it's a real delight and pleasure to be here with all of you and to discuss this important question. I want to begin by introducing my fellow panelists, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we have ahead. So first, I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is a distinguished professor at the National University of Singapore. So let me pull this up. Distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He worked in the Singapore Foreign Service for 33 years and had postings in Cambodia, Malaysia, Washington, D.C., and New York, where he twice was Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and served as president of the UN Security Council in January 2001 and May 2002. He was permanent secretary at the Foreign Ministry from 1993 to 1998. And then Mahbubani joined academia in 2004 when he was appointed the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS. He was dean from 2004 to 2017 and a professor in the practice of public policy from 2006 to 2019. In April 2019, he was elected as an honorary international member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and also selected as one of foreign policy's top global thinkers in 2010 and 2011. He has published 7 books, including Can't Asians Think?, Beyond the Age of Innocence, The New Asian Hemisphere, The Great Convergence, Can Singapore Survive?, The ASEAN Miracle, and Has the West Lost It? So very much looking forward to Professor Mahbubani's remarks. In addition, we are delighted to have Sarang Shidore with us. As Trita mentioned, Sarang recently wrote a brief for the Quincy Institute entitled De-risking the U.S.-India relationship, which we'll talk a little bit more about as the event unfolds. Sarang is a researcher and analyst in geopolitical risk, international relations, and energy and climate security, with a special emphasis on South Asia and additional expertise in scenario planning and strategic forecasting. He is currently senior research analyst at the University of Texas at Austin, senior fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks in Washington, and a consultant. He's consulted for and collaborated with multiple organizations and firms, including the Quincy Institute, Oxford Analytica, the Stimson Center, Stratfor, UK Ministry of Defense, Paulson Institute, and several others. He's published more than 60 articles in journals, edited volumes, and the media in his areas of expertise. And finally, I'd like to introduce Yoon Soon. Yoon Soon is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise in Chinese foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. From 2011 to early 2014, she was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, jointly appointed by the Foreign Policy Program and the Global Development Program, where she focused on Chinese national security decision-making processes and China-Africa relations. From 2008 to 2011, Yoon was the China analyst for the International Crisis Group based in Beijing, specializing on China's foreign policy toward conflict countries in the developing world. Prior to ICG, she worked on U.S.-Asia relations in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. So we're really excited to have all of you on this panel. And I wanted to kick it off by referring to the title that we've chosen somewhat provocatively to use for this event, which is the Quad's rise destabilizing Asia? Now, the Quad, or this, which is the more colloquial term for what is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, was inaugurated back in 2007. So it goes back a couple of decades, but after its early years, it sort of languished for quite some time. But it was really, and this of course is an arrangement among the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. And originally it was sort of a brainchild of Shinzo Abe when he was prime minister for the first time in Japan. And then, of course, many years later, when he was again prime minister and when Donald Trump was elected president in the United States, the forces aligned among these four countries to support a revival of the Quad in 2017. And in many ways, this became the premier institution through which the United States sought to engage in Asia during the Trump administration. Whereas previously, there had been more of an emphasis in the Obama administration on ASEAN-centered institutions like the East Asia Summit, for example. And so the question now is, as we look at the Biden administration, they've already indicated that they feel the Quad was one of the most effective components of the Trump administration's policy, and they have already had a Quad summit and are emphasizing that it will form a foundation of engagement in Asia. But this raises the question of, is this the right approach? This continuity from the Trump administration to the Biden administration on the Quad and perhaps on its strategy towards Asia more generally. So Professor Mahbubani, if we could start off with you, what's your take? Do you think the Quad's rise is destabilizing Asia?
Yeah. First of all, Rachel, thank you very much for welcoming me to this discussion. Thank you for the generous introduction. By the way, it's now 8 books, and the latest one is behind my shoulder. It's called U.S China 1, and in fact, I'll be using arguments from that book in my presentation here today. But the key point I want to make is that clearly it's not the Quad that is destabilizing Asia. Let's be clear about that. But what's destabilizing about the Quad is that it reflects the lack of an American strategy for managing the return of China to the world. And clearly, I mean, the United States has had a very successful track run, okay, for almost 250 years, and for 130 years, it's been the #1 power. It's never really lived in a world effectively where it was not the #1 power. But now it faces the very realistic prospect that within 10 years, 15 years, no matter when, the United States is going to become the #2 power in the world. So you need a comprehensive long-term strategy for managing this. And the danger of the Quad is that it creates an illusion that the United States is doing something serious about China, right? It's getting together with India, Japan, Australia, 4 of them, getting together, and China will be boxed in. And that's completely wrong, because the fundamental mistake of the Quad is that it doesn't understand that the fundamental competition in East Asia is not military, it's economic. And it is the economic power that will determine the outcome of the game and not the military balance. And here, the real game is in trade. And when China signs the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes ASEAN, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, that's the future. That represents the future. The Quad represents the past. It's a relic of a Cold War era thinking that thinks, hey, like the Soviet Union, all we have to do is build up a strong military alliance, and the Soviet Union collapse, China will collapse. That will not happen. Right? And that's the danger of the Quad. And of course, what makes it even worse is that, if you cannot be honest about what your mission is, it's very difficult to keep going. So in the latest statement, I think as Sarang pointed out, China is not mentioned. The whole purpose of the Quad is to balance China, but you can't talk about it. And clearly, when you talk about vaccine diplomacy, and really, vaccine diplomacy? I mean, look at Indonesia. Where is Indonesia getting its vaccines from? From China. So this is that's another layer of dishonesty that the Quad brings. And therefore, it's frankly, and all of us in this region, I want to emphasize, want the Biden administration to succeed. We don't want Trump to come back. Let's make that very clear. But you know, if you want to help the Biden administration, you've got to tell the Biden administration first, just reverse course on what Trump has done. It was a disaster. He lowered America's standing, didn't weaken China, alienated America's friends. So do a complete U-turn on many of Trump's policies, including the Quad. And then we'll have a better approach to this region.
Thank you. So Sarang, what do you have to say on this question, and any reactions to Professor Mahbubani's take on this? This question of, is it the Quad that's destabilizing Asia? Is it U.S. strategic thinking and sort of failure to adjust to China's rise, or something else?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you all of you for sharing this exciting event. And I'm very happy to be here. I just want to say at the outset that what I say today are my views and not necessarily those of those organizations that I'm affiliated with. But coming to the question, and in fact, Professor Mahbubani's very interesting remarks, I do agree with him that the predominant axis of interaction or competition in Asia is economic. But there is that detail of creating facts on the ground. If facts on the ground are created in a certain way, this can change. We are not close to that yet at all, but the trajectory of the Quad is destabilizing Asia. It's not the existence of the Quad itself. There are many groups in Asia. Asia is, in fact, a dense collection of various minilaterals and multilaterals. Even on security, you have the ASEAN Regional Forum. So adding another group is not a problem. It's really what the content and intent of the group is that is of concern. And here we have the Quad speaking a lot of things in its ministerial meetings that are hard to object to, such as free and open Indo-Pacific and vaccine diplomacy. All these are good objectives to pursue for all groups, in fact. But the facts on the ground, if you look at what is actually being done in the last 4 years of the Quad, the greatest energy has been on the military side. And it's really strange and interesting that it's really off the official Quad format. It's the 4 countries involved in the Quad that have essentially created connectivities within each other. And in a way, you can look back at history and look at the U.S. hub and spoke alliance that Asia started with back in the 60s and 70s after World War II. Since the early part of the century, what's happened is there's been a concerted effort to start tying the spokes together. So first, there was the Trilateral Strategic Dialogue involving India, Japan, and the United States. And that has been essentially bolstered by the addition of India. So the Quad can be seen as the next step in these trilaterals that were themselves an extension of the hub and spoke arrangement. So all of this leads to a perception that what is being built is a kind of an informal military bloc, certainly not a NATO. I think that question is a red herring. I don't think that possibility exists. It's a different kind of a situation in Asia. But any sort of formation of an informal military bloc will create or will enhance the classic security dilemma, which is one side's purchase of security leads to the other side's perception of threat. And indeed, this cycle can continue. So the risk here is not so much a Cold War, as has been pointed out many times. There are the conditions for a Cold War in many ways are dampened by the economic interdependence and the lack of terrains for proxy wars and so forth. The danger, in fact, again, we are not close to this yet, but the danger exists down the road that this could short circuit directly into a major power war rather than sort of stay in decades in a Cold War space. And that risk, small as it is the impacts of that are so catastrophic that we have to include it in our thinking and stay away from it.
Thank you. So before we turn to Yoon, I want to bring in a follow-up question from the audience that is relevant to things that you both have addressed thus far. From Kenneth Fong, he asks, the stated position of the US is not to contain China. So then what is the real objective of the Quad? You both have noted that, in statements issued by the Quad, there's, especially under the after this most recent summit and under the Biden administration, they're very studiously careful not to mention China and not to stress the hard security elements of it. But what do you see as the purpose of the Quad? And perhaps maybe from the perspective of India, maybe Sarang, you could speak to that, or from the perspective of the United States as well.
Well, I think in India, there is a great support for the Quad at this time. And that's a reflection of what has happened, particularly in the last year, where there have been indeed assertive and even aggressive Chinese actions on the border that have created great concern in the minds of the Indian policymakers and strategic community. The interesting thing, though, on that is this is an evolution over the last 4 years of increased border incidents, and there are complex reasons for it. But essentially, India is with the Quad at the moment. But underlying that convergence, there are certain structural facts on the ground that I think in the long run mean that India cannot be too deeply involved in the Quad's current trajectory. Now, the Quad could, of course, change its trajectory and change the way it is evolving, and that would be a very different sort of question we can address. But in the current trajectory of the Quad on the ground, India's interests with respect to its other side, the non-maritime side of the country, the Eurasian side, because there is an Indo-Pacific that is talked about enthusiastically, that we hear a lot about, but there's also Eurasia. And the Eurasia consists of countries that are either adversaries of India in many ways, such as China, or indeed partners of India. Both the adversaries or quasi-adversaries such as China and partners such as Russia or even Iran to an extent are not aligned. The policies are not exactly aligned with US preferences. So India paying attention to Eurasia is in some ways more important for India's security. India's vulnerability comes from the Eurasian side. The wars have been there. The only maritime attack India faced in recent decades has been actually from terrorists based in Pakistan on the western side of the Indian Ocean, not on the eastern side. So you see India's sensitivities of geography and the Quad's focus on the Western Pacific are substantially incongruent. And that is another area of divergence. So to conclude, India is enthusiastic now, but I think depending on the evolution of the Quad, India may start wanting to restrain some of its trajectories as they stand at the moment in the future.
Thank you. So Professor Mahbubani, what's your take on this, and what do you think the objective of the Quad is, at least in the Biden administration's mind?
Well, I mean, there's an old expression: if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And let's be clear about this. Everybody sees very clearly that the Quad is an anti-China alliance. I mean, let's not try to pretend it is not what it is. And actually, ironically, the proof is provided in a negative way, because there are close to 50 countries in Asia or more. Ask yourself a simple country: why aren't more countries knocking on the door of the Quad and say, "Hey, can we join? Can we join? Let us in, let us in." And even frankly, it would be logical to include the next major ally, United States, in East Asia is South Korea. South Korea's security depends on the United States of America. If South Korea joined, it would be called Squad, a very nice name. But South Korea is not rushing to join. And I think because the reason why countries are hesitant about the Quad is because they don't buy the fundamental premise that the best way of balancing China is to creating like old Cold War strategy of a new military alliance against China, because that's not the nature of the game. And when the United States uses the phrase Indo-Pacific, we are very happy. We like Indo-Pacific because we want India to be very much part of the game in East Asia. But the game in East Asia, let me go back to my first point, is about economics. And when India decided not to join the regional comprehensive economic partnership, and I want to emphasize that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the RCEP is going to create a formidable, dynamic, thriving economic ecosystem that will drive the future of Asia. If India is in RCEP, it's part of this dynamic ecosystem, then you have an Indo-Pacific. If India is out of the RCEP, there's no Indo-Pacific because India has been taken out of the RCEP. So that's why, as you know, in private, every ASEAN country is telling India, please join the RCEP. That's the real game. And that's why I think and that's why the Quad is a distraction. It creates the illusion that you're doing something about a region that's being transformed by the reemergence of China, but you're not joining the real game.
Excellent. So Yoon, let's get you in now to speak specifically to how China is perceiving the Quad. As Professor Mahbubani just said, even though it goes to great lengths, the Quad members go to great lengths to not bring up China. That's sort of the clear context. And is that how China perceives it? What's China's take on the Quad, and how is it seeking to respond to the growing emphasis on the Quad? And do you think that it has a stabilizing influence on the sort of U.S. China dynamic, or is it more destabilizing?
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for including me in this panel. I have enjoyed the first 20-something minutes of comments from Kishore and from my co-panelists. So before I go to China, I think this question on whether Quad is destabilizing is fascinating, because if you think about it, it takes two to tango. Because the assumption of the question sounds as if the region was perfectly stable, and the United States wakes up one morning and decides it needs Quad to somehow counter China without any context. And then the instability or the destabilizing effect follows. And that is not true, because we know this structural conflict between US and China had been there, and people had been writing about it, had been debating about it, and had been thinking about it for, I would say, at least a decade even before the Trump administration. So I guess a fair question is that, has China done anything that is destabilizing and from a Washington perspective that deserves to be countered? And I particularly enjoy Professor Mahbubani's analogy that if you walk like a duck, quacks like a duck, then you are a duck. Then I think for a lot of countries in the region, or a lot of countries in the West, if China behaves like a bully and talks like a bully, then who says it is not a bully? So if Japan and India and Australia all feel that they have concerns about China's behaviors, and they align their positions like they do have concerns about China's behaviors, then they probably do have legitimate concerns about China's behaviors. So I'm not trying to say that the Quad itself is the best strategy to counter what China has done, but I do think that there is a context, and there is also a China factor that needs to be addressed here. I agree that especially in Asia, economic relations and economic competition and trade in particular will determine who has the most significant influence in the region. But I also want to point out that if that is indeed how China sees the world, that it's all about economics, then China is already winning. So why would China still is so keen on developing their discourse, their soft power, their ideological influence, as well as their hard military power? If you look at China's definition of the comprehensive national power, CNP, its scope has gone far beyond the economic realm. It's a very comprehensive list that includes military power, diplomatic power, informational power, soft power, and especially the science and technologies, the technological innovation power, as well as the ability or the power to define and influence international rules and international order. So in that sense, I think from great powers perspective, competition is always going to be comprehensive, and it's not just about one factor. Coming back to the question, a question about how China sees Quad and how China reacts to Quad. I think the Chinese view of the Quad has been evolving, and in different stages or different phases that has different emphasis and different concerns. So, for example, I think during the Trump era, China was more concerned about what U.S. unilaterally or bilaterally could do to China. And because of the keen observation in Beijing that the allies or partners of the United States had a very high level of skepticism and suspicion of the U.S. credibility, and also the sustainability of the U.S. policy under Trump, I would say that before Biden administration, China's concern of Quad was not as strong as people imagined. But that does form a contrast to what happened after Biden's inauguration. And we see this systemization or this institutionalization of the Quad going in the direction of regular meetings and also leadership summit. But I think for China, bilateral is always important, more important than multilateral. And by that, what I meant to say is that how to manage relationship with Japan, with India, and with Australia in the Chinese eyes is more important than how to manage Quad as a multilateral system. And the assumption is that if Beijing could somehow manage the problems with Tokyo and with Delhi, then the ability or the effectiveness of Quad to in the regard of containing or limiting China is going to be affected. So I think on that, the Chinese pay a lot of attention to the inconsistency or the disagreements within the Quad among the four members about China. And several issues, just to point it out, like on Japan. Japan is still economically dependent on China, while it still plays a very high level of importance on economic relationship with China. And Japan doesn't share the same position on human rights issue, for example, as the United States. And looking at when China looks at the cooperation between US and India, they make the observation that India is more concerned about its land border in the north, while the US seems to be more interested in India playing a bigger role in the Indian Ocean region. And there are also issues of the defense, the technical issues of the defense cooperation, as well as the relationship between India and Russia. So I think what that means is that in the Chinese assessment, Quad could have substantive impact on specific technical issues related to China. But for the organization to evolve into a fixed China-focused security mechanism, the organization or the mechanism is still faced with a lot of constraints. So reflecting on China's attitude, I'll just point out two things. The first one is, I think for China, there's no doubt Quad is an American conspiracy or an American plan to establish an Asian version or the Indo-Pacific version of NATO. And that's targeting China. And the Chinese have been condemning that since day one. But on the other hand, I think in the Chinese assessments, Quad still suffers from a lot of innate weaknesses and constraints. And the Chinese see that too. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to start bringing in some more of the comments from the Q&A that pick up on some of the themes that have already arisen. One of these is from Michael Swain to Professor Mahbubani about, and it relates to the question, the comments that have been made as well by the other panelists about this economic dimension. If it is indeed the case that the sort of center of gravity in the competition in Asia is actually economic, then how does the Quad relate to that? We've discussed that perhaps there's this growing emphasis on hard security, but of course there also is this rhetoric about a free and open Indo-Pacific. And there seems to be this underlying assumption that China's rise represents a more mercantilist and predatory approach to Asian economic growth that requires opposition by these four Asian democracies. Is that true? And if so, then how should these countries be trying to counter that? Or is there a more accurate way of viewing this issue that will be more effective in guiding US strategy in the region? Professor Mahbubani?
Yeah, thank you. Happy to hear from Michael Swain. First of all, let me emphasize that I agree with Yun Sun on one point. You know, when this conversation began, I was in the room with a small cat. After 15 minutes, the cat's become a tiger. That's how China is viewed in the region. The cat has become a tiger, and we are now living next door to a tiger, and every country in this region has got concerns about this big new tiger that has emerged. Let's be very clear about that. I mean, we all have concerns about China. Therefore, that's not the issue. The issue is, how do you manage this tiger? How do you deal with it? And that's where the economic dimension comes in. And let me give you, maybe some data might help, okay? In the year 2000, just 20 years ago, U.S. GNP in nominal market terms was 8 times larger than China's. U.S. trade with Southeast Asia, with the 10 ASEAN countries, was 3 times China's trade with Southeast Asia. Fast forward 20 years, 2020, U.S. GNP is only 1.5 times bigger than China's, okay? And China's trade with Southeast Asia is now almost double that of the United States with Southeast Asia. So that indicates, in very simple terms, how the balance of power is changing. And you have to deal with the reality of the new balance of power, not any kind of wishful thinking that you can go back to the past. You cannot turn the clock backwards. And remember, every country in this region is now focused on 10 years from now. What kind of world will we have 10 years from now? That's what we have to deal with. 10 years from now, China's GNP will be bigger, probably, than the United States. 10 years from now, China's trade with this region will be much more, because of RCEP and everything else, than the United States. And so the United States has got to get back into the game as quickly as possible. And here, the one piece of credit I give to President Obama, he understood that. And that's how he proposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Frankly, for the United States to get back in the game, and by the way, there are open doors. All of the friends and allies of the United States would cheer if the United States would come back to the TPP. You know, and the Japanese said one good thing they did was to keep the TPP alive through the CPTPP, right? And so that's my big concern about the Quad. You know, they're playing exactly, they haven't got the eye on the ball. It's not about your military configuration. It's not about your military exercises. Because if your trade, for example, if your trade with China is 3 or 4 times your trade with the United States, which country do you pay more attention to, right? That's the nature of the game. The tragedy is that it would also be good for the American people, for the United States. I mean, Yun Sun mentioned the defense budgets. Yes, China's is growing, but you know, as Farid Zakaria said in his one recent columns, United States defense budget is larger than the next 10 countries combined. And is this large US defense budget a deterrence to China, or is it a gift to China? And frankly, it is a gift to China, because as Farid Zakaria again said in the same column, the United States spent $1.7 trillion on the F-35s, which will probably never be used. China spent $1.7 trillion on the Belt and Road Initiative. And just let me conclude with one story. You know, I spoke to an Indonesian minister recently. He says that when the Americans come to Southeast Asia or to Indonesia, say, hey, we must all stand up to China. Let's get together, stand up to China. But what is the United States bringing to the table? Nothing, right? Any road, any highway, any bridge. He said, when the Chinese come to South Indonesia, they say, oh, no, we would like to help you build a road, a highway, a bridge, a port. And as you know, one of the most important highways, Jakarta-Bandung, is being built by China. So when you are a developing country and your main concern is poverty reduction of your people and economic growth and development, what do you need now? Do you need a more closer defense ties, or do you need to have greater economic cooperation? And I actually believe the United States can win this economic game. It can. But it's got to focus on that.
So do you think, though, that there is is some of China's economic engagement mercantilist or in some way threatening to Southeast Asian nations? And Is there a need for the United States, India, Japan, Australia to counter that economic influence, or do you think that's a flawed characterization of China's economic influence?
Very, very quick point. You know, the term mercantilist, and I was student of philosophy here, automatically has negative connotations, which means that, oh, you are trapped into this. Let me emphasize that trade is voluntary, just like trade agreements are voluntary. As you know, India opted not to join the RCEP because it's voluntary, but all the 10 ASEAN countries joined the trade agreement. And at the end of the day, it's ironic that it is Western economic theories that taught us trade is not a zero-sum game. Trade is a positive-sum game. Ricardo's law of comparative advantage holds true. And what is, of course, paradoxical about the Quad is, look at how much more Australia trades with China than it does with the United States. And by the way, Australia is going to be the weak link in the Quad. And as you know, for some years, the reason, when you get your history of the Quad, you didn't mention why is it some countries opted out of the Quad, right? Opt-in, opt-out. That in itself shows the instability down there. And in the case of Australia, its economy is tied to China and will be increasingly tied to China. Even Japan, as Yun Sun said, does more trade with China. So at the end of the day, trade is a voluntary activity. It's a positive-sum game. And I think it would benefit the United States a lot if it signs free trade agreements with East Asia.
Thank you. So I want to give a question now to Sarang, and I want to connect this to the brief that Sarang wrote for the Quincy Institute entitled "De-risking U.S.-India Relations." And in that brief, you emphasize that the Quad as well is merging with, and especially the growing hard security emphasis of the Quad is merging with domestic developments in India to create a more risk-prone asymmetry in the relationship. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? And I want to bring in a question from Mark Tokola on this point, where he asks, might China not prefer a Quad in which the US is somewhat restrained by India's perspectives, rather than a lockstep alliance between Washington and Tokyo in which Japan might have a strong influence on the US policies? So, one point he seems to be raising here is that perhaps India could maybe exercise a somewhat stabilizing or influence on the United States as a member of the Quad. So there's maybe a few different pieces of that question, but could you take on maybe one or both of those?
Yeah, I think India actually was in the past more a restraining factor on the Quad. For example, the U.S. Just focusing a little bit on the U.S.-India defense relationship, because that's such a core part of the Quad. Without India, the Quad becomes remaps into the U.S., Japan, Australia trilateral. So India really makes it the Quad. And there was, for some time, Indian resistance to signing these military-to-military agreements called the foundational or facilitating agreements that bring the Indian military and security structures closer to the US security architecture. And in fact, India also ruled out doing joint patrols in areas far from its shores. Now that has all changed in recent years. And India is less of a restraint, but still behind the scenes, if you look at the press conference of the Indian Foreign Secretary, there was emphasis that the Quad is not against something, it is for something. And the word inclusive, reportedly, in the Leaders Summit joint statement, was inserted at the insistence of India. That's not confirmed, but that's what we hear. So at one level, India is very concerned about Chinese behavior in its north. At the other level, there's also the fact on the ground that as India has come closer to the US, on the security perspective, particularly, the other aspects are different. You're seeing a greater tension between India and China emerge on the border. So it doesn't mean causality is improved there. But nevertheless, the fact is, since 2016, as India has moved closer into the US security architecture, the incidents with China have grown. So at the very least, we can say that increased Indian melding is not helping its northern frontier. Maybe it is indifferent, perhaps, but So in the long run, I think there will remain and perhaps increase a Indian impulse for restraint, looking at Eurasia. Now, on the asymmetry question, in terms of the India-US relationship, I think for a long time the India-US relationship was relatively balanced. It had many facets to it. India was a very strongly growing economy, particularly in the first decade of this century. There were many possibilities on the US-India frontier in terms of trade, investment, cooperation on many other fronts. All of those are continuing. Trade and investment has grown, energy cooperation has grown, climate change is a major area of dialogue. But looking at India's recent economic performance, and one can argue really going back to 2012, if you look at the metrics such as export performance, if you look at gross capital formation, if you look at even other metrics such as employment and so forth, there is a noticeable slowdown in India and the Indian story in terms of the economic growth. These are deep structural reasons that are at work. But nevertheless, what has happened on one side, the Indian economic story has underperformed compared to expectations 10 years ago, let's say. And the security story with the US has actually accelerated at its fastest pace in the last 4 years. If you look at the agreement signed and the arms sales, a whole number of dimensions. So you're seeing a sort of an asymmetry emerge where security becomes heavier in the India-US relationship. And indeed, the first cabinet official that President Biden sent to New Delhi was not the Secretary of State or Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of Energy, but was the Secretary of Defense, General Lloyd Austin. And then, of course, John Kerry has recently visited the New Delhi on discussing climate change, which is a major priority for the Biden administration. But nevertheless, security has become relatively more significant in the India relationship, and that creates risks because US has a lot of asks of India, and some of those asks align with India's objectives. Others, such as the asks on Russia or Iran, or indeed Afghanistan historically, have not aligned with India's preferences. And as this asymmetry grows and the asks continue to grow, if the Quad again continues to evolve in the current trajectory, then we will see some sort of potentially a pushback from India, just looking at the structural situation on the ground.
Thank you. So I wanted to pick up on this theme of some of the mismatches of interests and perceptions among different Quad members. Paul here asks, what are the different threat perceptions of China among the 4 Quad members, and what are the mismatches there? And will that, do they have a common enough view of how to deal with China and enough confidence in each other for the Quad to reach and sustain critical mass? And a related question that Evan Sankey poses is, in some ways, Japan is perhaps, at least was one of the key initial drivers of the Quad. And to what extent are the other 3 members on the same page as Japan? We've talked about some of the differences between the US and India, but what about the Japan element of this? And I'll just bring in one other question on this that perhaps could be an interesting contingency to look at is the question of Taiwan. Over the last week when Suga and Biden issued their joint statement, of course, there was a lot of attention to the reference to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait in that statement. Although, of course, since then, Suga has been at pains to send some signals that Japan would not be eager to get involved in a military conflict over Taiwan. What is the Quad's views on threat perceptions on Taiwan? And are there any sort of commonalities there, or what differences exist? So I know there's a lot of different angles through which you could approach this question, but maybe Yoon, could you speak to that question first?
I'll try. Those are great questions. I think first on what the 4 countries could cooperate on and what they can work together. I think the issue is really not black or white. They can cooperate or they cannot cooperate. I think it depends on the issue, depends on the level of cooperation that we're talking about, and it depends on the comfort level that each member of the Quad is willing to carry. So, for example, I know that one thing that has annoyed China significantly after the leadership summit last month was this issue of the COVID vaccine cooperation among the Quad members, and how that is going to play out India's production capability and the technology from the other members, and also the financing or the capital from other members. So I think that is an example where practical cooperation on specific issues or substantive issues is possible without having to have a hat saying that, oh, this is to counter China's vaccine diplomacy. So I think so my answer is that Quad cooperation is not yes or no. It's either black or white, that there's cooperation or there's no cooperation. I think it depends on the issue. I think Dr. Alan Feigenbaum also wrote a piece before the leadership summit advocating for a position that Quad should focus on the issues instead of the mechanisms. Should focus on the specific and practical, pragmatic cooperation. And I think that's a very practical way to go. On the Taiwan issue, I'll just briefly mention this. I think the assumption of that question is that the war over Taiwan is quite imminent. And I think that issue is, at least that assumption is debated, and I personally don't believe it is going to happen. And I wrote about it last week. So I think the Chinese national priority, as defined by its 14th five-year plan and by its 2035 vision, is still heavily or almost solely focused on the national development of its economy and of its domestic situation. Is not national unification. So it's not to say that the China cannot change its priority down the road, but to say that China is going to launch an attack on Taiwan in the next couple of years, I think that simply ignores the political reality that is going on in China today. So as for what Quad can do, I think Taiwan has been very eager to engage in or to play a bigger role, play a more positive role in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think there are unofficial or systematic ways to involve Taiwan more in this regional mechanism. But as for specifically what Quad can do, I think each of the Quad member has an interest in engaging Taiwan, probably on an unofficial level, but nevertheless will still strengthen their bilateral relationship on an unofficial level. But if we're talking about a military contingency, I think that premise is flawed. Thank you.
Thank you. And on a somewhat related note, Kishore, I'll turn to you, but I want to bring another question from Yves Tabergian here, where he mentions, how can we make sense of China's actions on the Indian border, or perhaps, vis-a-vis Taiwan or the Senkaku issue, where it does seem that China has engaged in more assertive ways than it has in the past? What's explaining China's behavior, and wouldn't it make sense for China, to pursue more conciliatory policies towards Japan and India, to try to break up the Quad to some extent? And what do you think China's rationale is in these contingencies, in these scenarios?
Well, you know what, on China, India, I'll let Saran answer that question. He knows much more than I do. But, since you told us at the beginning of this discussion that maybe from time to time we should disagree with each other, I would definitely defer to Yun Sun's judgments on China. She knows China better than I do. But I would say on Taiwan, it would be a huge mistake to ignore the fact that China has some hard red lines on Taiwan. I mean, let me give you an example. In Southeast Asia, frankly, on the 9-dash line and all that, frankly, at the end of the day, all these things are negotiable. But there are issues on Taiwan that are non-negotiable. So any suggestion that if the United States or Japan or India or anyone else is pushing Taiwan towards becoming an independent state, that in a sense, you push the Chinese leaders against the wall, and they have no choice but to react very strongly. And I can tell you, most countries in this region, most of the time, are very, very careful on the Taiwan issue, because at the end of the day also, all of us have signed formal agreements with China saying that we accept a one China policy. And even Australia has signed that agreement. So while there may be, and by the way, it's good to have unofficial links to Taiwan. I'm not saying that's wrong. We should. I mean, one of the first places I'm going to visit as soon as COVID-19 is over, I'm going to go to Taiwan. I love Taiwan. And actually, I've been invited to give a speech there in Taiwan. So I'm going to go there. But at the same time, we must understand that Taiwan really is an issue that is very different. And therefore, when the Trump administration changed the fundamental agreement, which is that the United States would not send current officials to Taiwan, but retired officials to Taiwan, right? That was the understanding. Trump administration upended it. By the way, no other country does that. No? Let me emphasize that. And then the best thing the Biden administration has done, and I give compliments to the Biden administration, when they wanted to send a delegation to Taiwan, they sent Senator Dodd, former Deputy Secretary of State Undertage, former Deputy Secretary of Jim Steinberg. That was wonderful. That was a clear signal that Biden administration is going back to the previous understanding. And by the way, the Japanese of all people have to be very sensitive on Taiwan, because the separation of Taiwan, as we know, began with the 1895 war between China and Japan. And as you know, Taiwan was seceded to Japan. And so if I was a responsible Japanese long-term planner, the biggest mistake that Japan could make is to remind the Chinese people, by the way, I slapped you around for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. And guess what? I enjoyed doing it, and I'm going to mention it again. That would be the stupidest thing for Japan to do. Because, going back to what Ezra Vogel's book in China, Japan emphasizes, for most of the time, China and Japan lived in peace with each other. So if I was a Japanese long-term economic planner for Japan's security, I would try to go back to the period before the 50 years of Japanese humiliation of China. And to go back to that should be the goal of Japan. And touching on Taiwan, it just means that the Japanese are waving a red flag in front of the Chinese, which is unwise, which is why, as Yoon Sun herself said, Suga quickly ran away of Taiwan, which is the right thing for Japanese to do. The only people who should say nothing on Taiwan is Japan.
Thank you. So I want to be conscious of the time. We just have about five or so minutes left before we need to wrap up. I do want to get a few more questions in. So Yoon, could you briefly speak to this? Maybe just under a minute. Why do you think China is behaving in these assertive ways vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis Southeast Asian nations, and it's especially these territorial sovereignty disputes? Why isn't it adopting a more conciliatory approach in order to mitigate their willingness to balance with other countries?
I'll try for 1 minute. There is a debate as for whether China is operating from a position of weakness, which made it overreact, or China is operating from a position of strength, which makes it even more emboldened. I think last year, a lot of things that happened during the COVID, especially during the era when China was widely attacked internationally for being the origin of the COVID, a lot of that originated from a sense of vulnerability. That the Chinese felt that we're attacked on this many fronts and this many different levels, then we need to push back. Otherwise, they're only going to come at us even more strongly. But I think after 2020, the Chinese action is more motivated from a perception or conviction that China has weathered the storm. Not only the storm of the COVID, and China has done better than most of the countries in the almost all the countries in the world. And China has also weathered the storm of the Trump administration. So although China suffered from COVID, when China looks at the power balance between U.S. and China, it will say that, hey, U.S. suffered a bigger loss. So as a sheer relative or the comparative gains, China sees that as a result of COVID, the power balance between U.S. and China continue to shift in China's favor. So I think a lot of the actions that we're seeing today originates from that sense of confidence. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to turn to Sarang for a couple of questions that are speaking to India's strategic environment. And there was an interest from Barnett Rubin in your comments on Eurasia and the Eurasian concerns that India has. And he asks, he's noticed that the Quad, like the Obama era pivot to Asia, is a manifestation of the US conception of Asia as the Asia Pacific, while ignoring the growing importance and dynamism of Eurasia. And so could you speak to that? And a related question from from Bin Yu is that he's asking, how will India juggle its Quad role with its traditional role of non-alliance and its membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its traditional relations with Russia? And how is India going to navigate these strategic dimensions? And in what ways should the United States adjust its relations with India to reflect this? I know you speak somewhat to this in your brief, but could you speak to that here?
Sure. I think Eurasia is massively under-mentioned or under-discussed in Indian strategic circles, and the government, of course, is very aware of it, I believe. But one cannot just speak of the Indo-Pacific. The Eurasian landmass is actually India's zone where it has the least connectivity today. If you think of India's connectivity with the outside world in terms of train, the maritime space through the Indian Ocean is proceeding smoothly as of this point, has been for a long time. It's the Eurasian landmass where connectivity, for example, an India-Iran gas pipeline did not happen because of various reasons. India-China connectivities have been minimal on the land border. There is some trade, but most of the trade is maritime. With Pakistan, there's been a very difficult relationship. Central Asia connectivity is very much below the potential it can have. So India faces Eurasia, not just as a security challenge, but also as a challenge of isolation, in a sense. Sounds strange because India in many ways is globally integrated, but on the land side, there's a long way to go before India is integrated with its north and its west. And this is an area that India cannot just sail off into the maritime distance, especially into the South China Sea and even the Southern Indian Ocean, without realizing that the deficits are really to its north and west. And I think that's, again, a structural issue that will emerge sooner or later. It is going to be hard to just wish it away. I forgot your second question if we have time for it.
Well, we're just about out of time. I do want to give Professor Mahbubani a chance to get in here with a final comment, perhaps tying into what Sarang just mentioned about connectivity. Adam Samowitz mentions the One Belt, One Road initiative. And in your opinion, does this do more for China's stability and longevity in global markets? Is there a way for the Quad, or just perhaps for the United States or India, to compete better with One Belt, One Road? You've of course mentioned RCEP, TPP. Ideally, these would be ways that we could re-engage in the economic game in Asia, promoting this kind of connectivity. But short from joining those trade agreements, are there other forms of investment, whether cooperative or competitive with China, that Asian nations would welcome as a way to, for the United States and India and others to become more competitive and constructive?
Let me end on an optimistic note. Yes, US can win. And the US can win by playing the game that it used to play in Southeast Asia. And as you know, the United States investment in Southeast Asia, by the way, is larger than its investment in Japan, Korea, China combined, by the way. And there are huge reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States in Southeast Asia. And one of the key reasons is investment by American companies. And so I would say that the reason why the Chinese have an advantage in the Belt and Road Initiative is because the Chinese government is better at doing things than the US government is. But at the same time, the American private sector is better at doing things than the Chinese private sector is. And if you can unleash American companies and get American companies to step up their investment, and by the way, countries in this region, every country in this region will welcome American investment. I want to emphasize that. Okay, it's worked very well for this region. And so the real secret weapon that America can unleash, by the way, including in Eurasia, which I agree with Sarang is under discussed in all this, is American private investment.
Excellent. Thanks so much. We have to wrap up now, and I'll pass it back over to Trita, but I really appreciated this engaging discussion and the range of perspectives shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you so much to Yoon, to Kishore, and to Sarang. It was a fantastic conversation. We are a foreign policy think tank, but this is probably the first time, at least that I can think of, in which we talked about ducks, cats, and tigers, but it was done in the most fitting way. Before I let everyone go, I want to mention our future panels, the three ones that we have scheduled for the next 2 weeks. Tomorrow, we will host a panel titled SOS, Sino-American Cooperation Needed to Save the Planet. It's about the need for the United States and China to collaborate to be able to defeat climate chaos. And we will have speakers including Joanna Lewis of Georgetown University, Jonas Nam of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and Alex Wang of UCLA. Then on April 28th, we will have a panel discussion on whether we need to start rethinking broad-based economic sanctions, mindful of their tremendously devastating impact, humanitarian impact on civilian populations. Speakers include Peter Beinart, Asli Bali, and Josh Landis. And finally, on April 30th, we will host a discussion on how Biden reached a conclusion to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and whether he will be able to keep his word. Ambassador Richard Olson, Vanda Felba Brown, and Dr. Jonathan Schroden will speak on that panel. So if you haven't signed up yet, please go to quincyins.org, sign up for our mailing list. You will get notification of all of our future panel discussions, webinars, as well as our written products. So with that, thank you so much and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.